This is a conversation with Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He's a biomedical gerontologist and a leading figure in the field of longevity science. He's best known for his work on the strategies for engineered negligible senescence approach, which breaks aging down into a set of biological processes that we may one day repair or reverse. His research and advocacy have pushed longevity sciences from the fringes of speculative biology into mainstream scientific and philosophical discourse. Today we talk about the future of aging, the ethics of life extension, and what it means to fundamentally alter the human lifespan. Is radical life extension possible? Should it be? And if so, how do we get there? This is the Acc Podcast. Welcome. Let's talk about it.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Dr. de Grey, I wanted to start with a simple sort of fundamental question. You've obviously spent a lot of your career arguing that aging is not an inevitable, unchangeable process, but rather like this biological problem that we can intervene in.
Right.
Yet, obviously, despite all these advances in geroscience and just longevity research in general, there's still some public skepticism and scientific skepticism that remains widespread. We're seeing things like the Pew Research studies that while many people believe others would want to extend their lifespan, a lot of people don't want it for themselves. And even today, aging isn't classified as a disease by the FDA, which I assume can make it somewhat difficult to secure funding for interventions targeting aging itself rather than just age-related diseases. I just wanted to ask you first, to start this off, why do you think some of this resistance is persisting? Do you think it's primarily cultural? Do you think it's rooted in like deep-seated narratives about the naturalness of aging? Or do you think that skepticism kind of stems from more like institutional and scientific conservatism? And how do you think the field can begin to overcome some of these barriers?
Yeah, well, the main answer actually is pretty much the same as what I was going to say before you finished your question. Namely, I don't like your question because it entangles too many different questions. So my main answer is that the way we go about waking society up is by disentangling the various things that you just mentioned in your question. So first of all, there's disentangling the desirability and the feasibility thing. So clearly there are, people out there who think that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise, where think is perhaps a little bit overly complimentary. What they actually do is they allow themselves to convince themselves of things that they know are completely irrational that lead to that conclusion, which is not really the same. But anyway, the point is, yes, there are, people will with a genuinely straight face, they will say things like, "Oh, death gives meaning to life," or "Won't dictators live forever," and stuff like that, right? So that's one side. But the other side, of course, is they feel like aging is somehow woven into the fabric of the universe and is somehow, not amenable to medical intervention, even in principle, let alone medical intervention anytime soon. And the biggest problem is this disentangling thing. I've been saying for very, very, very many years that a huge part of the problem is that people allow those two issues to reinforce each other in a kind of feedback loop. That they will kind of refuse to have a serious conversation about whether aging really is woven into the fabric of the universe, because they will say, well, it doesn't really matter, because the fact is it would be a bad idea to fix aging anyway, so why bother thinking about whether we could? And the same people, at the same time, will say the converse. They will say, well, it doesn't really matter whether aging is actually a blessing in disguise, because the fact is we can't do anything about it anyway. So the first step is to embarrass people into addressing those two questions separately, which is insanely hard to do, even for otherwise perfectly rational people, because there is such a desperate compulsion to find some way to avoid getting one's hopes up, right? That aging might be brought under medical control in time for oneself. It is, it's just psychology. Most people are bloody cowards and they're just weak-willed and they refuse to think seriously. Which, as you can tell, winds me up. But there you go. So then there's that. That's the first of that. But then there's the next question. If we just forget about the absurd desirability business and we just talk about feasibility, there's feasibility in principle and there's feasibility anytime soon, right? Now, feasibility in principle is the kind of thing that gets obfuscated by the issues are of terminology, as in whether is aging a disease. If you say aging is a disease, you've got problems because people think of it as something that can be cured in the same way that an infection is cured. You can actually just do one thing, and then the person doesn't suffer from the thing that problem again unless they get in some way reinfected. We're definitely not going to do that with aging, because aging is a side effect of being alive, right? But equally, if you say that aging is not a disease, then that makes people rush to the idea that aging is, in fact, in general, in principle, not amenable to any kind of medical intervention. So, come the revolution, when I rule the world, it will be illegal to use the word aging and the word disease in the same sentence, because whatever way you relate them, you mess people's heads up, right? All right, so I call aging a medical condition. That works fairly well. It says it's amenable to medical intervention, but don't call it a disease because there's too many connotations, too much baggage, right? All right, so I think that answers most of what you asked.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question was going to be, how do you define aging? So you've done that, laid that out quite nicely for me.
Well, let me do that better than I did just now.
Sure.
Because from the point of view of any biologist, it is actually very important to define aging in a way that's much more straightforward, much clearer than what people normally do. And in fact, to be honest, even from the point of view of a non-biologist, that's important. All I've said so far is aging is a side effect of being alive. That's not quite good enough. What I think is very important to emphasize is that we must start from the fact, it's not a hypothesis, it's a fact, that the body is a machine. Okay? It's a really, really complicated machine, and we didn't build it, so, we didn't design it, so we don't really know how it works and all that. So that's bad, but the fact is it's a machine. What does that even mean? What it means is that the body's function is determined by its structure, right? Now, that turns out, despite sounding terribly facile and, boring, to be a really important thing to start from. Because what it tells us is that if we want to get this machine to work properly for longer than it otherwise would, then we might be able to get some lessons from seeing how we already successfully do exactly that with other simple machines, right? Like man-made ones, like cars. And of course, there are cars that are existence proofs of this, right? There are cars that are more than 100 years old that were certainly not designed to last 100 years. They were designed to last 10 or 15 years. So how did we do that? And of course, the answer is preventative maintenance. What we did was we, figured out various, this collection of ways to, scrape the rust off and decontaminate the oil and all that kind of stuff, so that the thing actually works just as well as when it was built, the day it was built, however long ago it was built. If you'd asked someone 100 years ago whether that was possible, whether their car would last 100 years, they'd have laughed at you. But if you ask someone today who owns a car that's 100 years old, and you ask them whether it's going to be going out in another 100 years, they'll say, well, of course, why not? We'll just carry on doing the same stuff, right? So what does that mean in practical terms? What it means is that aging is the combination of two processes. There's a process that goes on throughout life, even starting before we're born, which is simply the accumulation of damage, the accumulation of changes to the molecular and cellular structure of the body. The reason why the word damage is the right word to use to describe those changes is because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that change without a significant decline in physical or mental function, but only a certain amount. And eventually, you've got more damage than that, and the body starts to go downhill. And that's the second process, of course. So the first process happens throughout life. The second process, which kicks off when you've got more damage than what the body is built to tolerate, that kicks off late in life, and that's when we go downhill and further downhill and dead. So that's what aging actually is. And it's exactly the same. We could describe aging of a car in exactly the same way. From the day it's born, it rolls off the production line, it starts accumulating rust and other stuff like that. And if you don't get rid of the rust, then eventually the doors fall off. Exactly the same. People don't like that. People don't like to think. People like to say, ooh, that's a terribly, oversimplistic analogy, but that's bollocks. It's not an oversimplistic analogy at all. It's perfectly good. The two reasons why people say that it's oversimplistic are, number one, the human body is so much more complicated than any man-made machine. Well, of course it is, but that's a difference of degree. It's not an actual difference, right? And the second one, they say, well, look, the body's got all these wonderful automatic built-in self-repair processes. The issue is that those self-repair processes don't work forever. But of course, that just completely ignores the fact that there's something that makes the self-repair processes work less well late in life. And that, of course, is the accumulation of changes to the structure and composition of the body that we don't have self-repair processes for, even when we're young, because we didn't evolve them, because they don't matter enough to evolution, because they happen too slowly, right? Now, that's so bleeding obvious. And what it means is that the self-repair processes we do have are not a reason why preventative medicine would not work. On the contrary, it's why it's practical. It makes it easier. If we did not have those processes, then first of all, we wouldn't live more than about a week. And second of all, they're on our side. So our job as medical researchers is to augment the self-repair processes that exist already, to fill in the gaps that evolution has left.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not about, some may argue that, why are you tampering with humans' natural processes of aging? Where some people argue that, we're all meant to die. It's wrong of science to try and come in and interfere with this natural process. But the argument is that, when we're born, we have these gaps in our biology and our systems that us as scientists, we can augment. As you said, we can help fill in some of those gaps. And we do that with modern medicine to a certain extent. So with lots of other, you just mentioned not to call aging a disease, but with other diseases that aren't aging, we do that already. And so,
Right.
Why not apply some of those processes to the medical condition of aging?
Precisely. Of course, we really must be very aggressive in ridiculing the idea that aging should not be interfered with because it's natural. Every single thing that we do in any technology, including medicine, involves, manipulating things that existed before, and things that are natural. Tuberculosis is natural, and most of us are fairly happy that we don't have very much of it anymore.
Yeah, that's super interesting. A lot of us don't realize that we actually have latent TB just like in our bodies. It's crazy.
Well, I'm sure you know the statistic,
Yeah,
right? About 200 years ago, literally more than 1/3 of babies were before the age of 1, a lot of them from tuberculosis, even in the wealthiest countries in the world. And now, kind of, that doesn't happen, and most people think that's rather a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to, ask, we're talking about aging as the cause of deficiencies in things that we're born with or things that at evolution we just haven't adapted to. I think you touched on this briefly, but I wanted to ask you, why do humans and living organisms age? Why did
Mhm.
we as organisms evolve this way in such a way that we die over a set number of years? Because there's species, right? Like certain jellyfish and like lobsters that seem to escape aging or they age at dramatically different rates. I wanted to ask you from an evolutionary standpoint, aging seems to persist as a somewhat like nearly universal. It obviously we all die, but we maybe different
Right.
rates of aging exist.
Right. So,
Yeah, go for it.
so it was in the early part of the 20th century that a few people started to get the message that aging was not a disease like an infection. Whether you would call it a disease or not, it was not like infections. And the kind of medicine that they had been able to implement so extraordinarily successfully over the previous, starting maybe 50 years earlier with Pasteur and Jenner and so on, against infections, was not going to work against the health problems of late life, the progressive chronic thing. And they thought, why not? And they realized that they've just got to be more preventative, because these progressive diseases cannot just be attacked. There must be something that makes them progressive. They didn't really think about it back then in the nice, crisp way that I've just described it, but close enough. And so they said, let's be more preventative. And what they did was they looked at exactly what you just said. They looked at the living world and they said, well, wait, this looks cool. There are some species that age much more slowly than others. And yes, we humans already age unusually slowly compared to most species, but nevertheless, if we study this variation between species, maybe one day we'll understand it well enough that we'll be able to, translate that understanding into some kind of medical intervention to make us age more slowly. going back to the analogy with cars or whatever, you can think of it as kind of, in some way, make the body run more cleanly. And, this seemed pretty hopeful. And then in the 1930s or so, people started to notice that there were easy ways to make mammals, not just like, fruit flies, but mammals live considerably longer than they normally would. The one way it was done, of course, was calorie restriction. So, that was a very reproducible phenomenon. Took decades before people started to actually try and come up with real mechanistic understanding of how it works. And even that was very, very oversimplistic for a long time. But at least they were trying. However, of course, it was kind of well understood by that time that biology is quite complicated. And therefore, this was a complete false dawn. What you were doing with calorie restriction was activating something that evolution has already created for you, right? Something that the body already has as a response. And the worst of it was, and this became very apparent over like the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and it was aggressively and shamefully swept under the carpet, is that calorie restriction just doesn't work so well in long-lived species as what it does in short-lived species. And therefore, if we really want to do anything significant about aging, it is not the way to go. It's bleeding obvious. I was so astonished when I was in my first few years in the field, when I began to realize that this was being swept under the carpet, that I made a big fuss about it and wrote a nice paper that I had a lot of trouble getting published. But anyway, the point is, it wasn't the way to go. Messing with our metabolism is not how we're going to make people live significantly longer in a healthy state, because the creation and accumulation of damage is just too intrinsically intertwined in this insanely complicated network of processes that we call metabolism. And when I came along and I realized that everyone was overlooking the possibility of just eliminating the damage every so often, preventative maintenance, I still really can't get my head around how it was that this was overlooked for so many decades. I mean, basically for the entire 20th century until I came along, right? Which is crazy. But here we are,
Yeah, no, interesting. You were saying that like calorie, because like that's a pretty big subfield of aging research, is that restricting calorie intake can help slow down some of the markers of aging from like the metabolism from the blood.
Forget about slowing down some of the markers. It definitely slows down aging, as in it makes organisms live longer, not just average lifespan, but maximum lifespan.
Right. But you're saying
It
that
only
like
does it up to a point.
Yeah.
So, if we ask, why does it only do it up to a point? Again, it's evolution. Evolution is actually, it's really easy to put oneself in the shoes of evolution, to ask oneself, okay, what are evolution's motive? Evolution doesn't give a flying fuck about individual people, individuals.
Right.
Only cares about genes. And reproduction is quite a good way to perpetuate genes. So individual lifespans matter not in the slightest to evolution. So anything that only affects older people or older individuals doesn't matter. So then we have to ask, what's this got to do with calorie restriction? It's just one unbelievably simple fact. Namely, long famines happen less often than short famines. That's all you need in order to immediately deduce that calorie restriction is not going to work so well in long-lived organisms. The amount of time that a famine lasts is independent of the natural lifespan of the population that is experiencing the famine, right? Therefore, what's going to happen is that famines that happen often enough are going to impose selective pressure to evolve mechanisms to optimize for them. And famines that don't happen often enough are not. Duh. Right? So basically, what we see, to a pretty good approximation, is that if you go all the way from bloody nematodes that live 3 weeks to us that live a century, then the difference in the absolute amount in terms of months or years by which you can extend life using calorie restriction hardly alters at all. Of course, sometimes you do it with genetic manipulation. These days, you've got things like rapamycin, pharmacological manipulation,
Mm-hmm.
all the same. Same pathways being turned on, same gene expression pattern changes. The goal from evolution's point of view is simply to hunker down and get through the famine with some probability. Because the idea, of course,
Sure.
is that if you have offspring during the famine, then they will die of starvation before they have their own offspring, so it's a waste of effort, right? So you might as well allocate all the energy and resources that you might have allocated into reproduction, into hunkering down. It's, how obvious is that, right? So that means that, sure enough, you can get nematodes to live like 6 months longer, which is about 10 times longer than they normally live, by calorie restriction done in the right way. You can get mice to live a year longer. You can probably get monkeys to live a year and a half longer. The ratio of these numbers is not the same as the ratio of the lifespan, not by very long.
Right. That's interesting. That's not a lot of time at all. Kind of puts things into perspective.
Mhm.
I wanted to dive deeper into, your kind of framework for the research that you do versus what we're kind of seeing in the aging field.
Okay.
Starting obviously with the SRF, you founded it in 2009, and your framework for solving aging kind of focuses on repairing damage rather than slowing it down, as you've implied many times. I just want to, can you maybe explain the rationale behind this
Well,
approach
sure.
versus what other
Well,
scientists are doing?
it actually goes back a little further. So my first foundation was the Methuselah Foundation, which I co-founded in 2003. The idea of damage repair being the way to go came to me in 2000, and I published the key paper on that in 2002. So yeah, well, I mean, it's just totally obvious that if you want to go further than simply activating pathways that the body already has built in for some evolutionary reason, like CR, then you're just not going to do it by manipulating metabolism, because metabolism is too complicated and everything talks to each other too much. You are going to have unintended consequences that do more harm than good. It's just like, but you don't need to. And in the same way that you don't need to understand the chemistry of rusting in order to get rid of the rust on a car. You just get rid of it, right? Now, the mistake that all these non-engineers who were studying aging were thinking was they were thinking, well, slowing down aging is slowing it down. Reversing aging is more than slowing it down. Therefore, it's obviously harder, and we'll worry about trying when we've figured out how to slow down aging a bit more than we currently can, right? Completely
Okay.
missing the point that damage repair is not reversing the process by which the damage came into existence. It's reversing the outcome. It's taking an end run, going back to where things were structurally without,
Sure.
I mean, this is what you get when you train people to be scientists and not engineers. A large part of the reason why I switched fields, I was originally a computer scientist, was because I realized this. It was through my first wife, who was very much a basic scientist, and who, first of all, just like blew my mind when it became apparent that she just thought aging was not her problem. Right? Genuinely, that was what she would say, and I would say, well, it kind of is. But secondly, it was through talking to her that I began to understand this profound and absolutely catastrophic chasm of mindset between the basic scientists who are curiosity-driven and the technologists who want to manipulate nature. Because technologists want to understand the thing they're manipulating enough to be able to get the manipulation right. Whereas basic scientists, the idea of knowing enough just doesn't compute. Right? The only good questions are ones whose answers create new questions, because they want to find things out for the sake of finding things out.
Yeah.
Speechless.
That's basic science.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good point there about, field of translational versus basic science research and maybe the disconnect there might be. Okay. I wanted to now shift towards sort of the aging movement, the broader longevity movement as a whole.
Okay.
Obviously, it's exploded in the past few years. Figures like Bryan Johnson, David Sinclair, Peter Attia have really popularized that conversation on social media. I just, very candid question, kind of what's your take on this?
It's largely my fault. So of course I'm happy about it. I mean, I can't, of course, it's only largely my fault. It's not entirely my fault. David and I have been great friends for 20 odd years, and we shot to prominence at basically the same time. The point at which I started to introduce and propound and generally sell the idea of damage repair was basically simultaneous with when David started to do the same thing for the idea of calorie restriction mimetics, starting with resveratrol, and of course going forward through NAD precursors and so on. So yeah, I mean, obviously we've both got the same goals. We've been pursuing them in somewhat different ways. We have a lot in common. We are, profoundly iconoclastic, both of us. I am, because I went to the same school as half of the prime ministers in England, and so I know exactly how unintelligent they are. And he is, because he grew up in Australia. But, we also have a lot of differences. Like, I would not have kids to save my life, and he's got 3 of the fuck. And then, I don't have an entrepreneurial bone in my body, and he is very proudly entrepreneurial. So, we're very different as well, and that has worked out very well, of course. It takes a village, right? Bryan Johnson, another example, obviously more recent arrival on the field, though, in fact, he was started to get interested in this quite a long time ago. About a decade ago, he came to my lab. He was thinking about, this. He wasn't really keen on philanthropy, and of course, I run a non-profit, so he never actually gave us any money, but he, he was interested in putting money in as an investor into various things, and that worked out okay.
Right. That's cool.
And now, of course, he's throwing his weight around a great deal. A lot of people think he's doing an enormous amount of damage to the field, by talking about lifestyle too much and so on. But I've been there. An awful lot of people who are now good friends of mine used to say and think that I was doing a lot of damage to the field. So I don't object to that. And, looking at what he's actually doing and not doing, I think, he's definitely an unequivocal net positive to the field. He could be prioritizing how he spends his very significant wealth in a different way. He could be putting money into early stage research, like, for example, me. But he's doing okay. And Attia, well, let me talk about Attia for a second, because the fact is,
Sure.
I do have a bit of a problem with Attia, and with a few people like him, like Huberman. They're authoritative, but with that comes responsibility, and anything you say had better not be damaging. And one thing that Attia and other people like him are problematically prone to do is to be what I have called longevity deniers. They understand that essentially there's no point in extending sick span. We want to extend health span, right? But whereas I would go and say, like, we want to extend health span, that's what we do, that's what we work on, and lifespan is a side effect of health span. What they say is, well, yeah, maybe it's a side effect, but they kind of downplay that. They almost apologize for that, as if, we shouldn't be thinking about lifespan as a goal, Whereas, of course, what I do is I celebrate that. I think that, the longer we live healthy, the better. And if the side effect is that we live, our total lives are increased, then better yet, especially because that gives us more opportunity to extend health span even further still, and so on.
Right.
So I kind of have a bit of a problem with prominent people who are inclined to distance themselves from the idea of radical life extension as a goal, which Attia certainly does.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm not seeing something here, but what would be, I guess, what's the argument for that? Like, what is the harm? And obviously you increase health span, increase lifespan. Isn't that a good thing? Like, I'm not seeing the side.
The argument really, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the conflation of feasibility and desirability. Attia has the problem that he's an MD, not a PhD. Well, I am, of course, being a little bit flippant when I call it a problem, but it's kind of where it starts. Because the problem with being an MD is that you have spent, at least your training and perhaps longer, being confronted day in, day out with how pathetically poor our current medical prowess actually is, right? And so you are inculcated with the idea that, radical control over something that we have so little control over at the moment is just science fiction. And therefore you're inclined to say so, and you're inclined to, to ridicule people who say the opposite, and who want to actually work for it. And so that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, cool. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about, where I wish Bryan Johnson put more of his money into funding research rather than his, I assume, very expensive lifestyle. I wanted to ask you just about kind of the state of funding for this type of research. You have often sort of critiqued that, oh, there's not enough. But now that we see billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Bryan Johnson to some extent funding it, what are your thoughts now? Any optimism? Do you still think we need more? Like, it would be great to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts.
So for wealthy people, putting money into this field is unequivocally a very great deal better than the prior situation where they weren't. But it's not nearly as good as it could be. The first person who first seriously wealthy person who put money into this field is a guy named Larry Ellison. You may have heard of him. He's probably in
Eh,
the top 10
yeah.
wealthiest people in the world. In the late 1990s, he created something called the Ellison Medical Foundation. Now, there are various narratives about why he did it, but that doesn't really matter. The fact that he did do it, he created a foundation, and over the subsequent 15 years, he put $500 million into it, right? Which is, not as much as what's happening these days, but it was a hell of a lot back then. And, it was all focused on aging. Fantastic. No? No. Because then what he had to do is decide how he was going to allocate this money. And the fucking idiot said to himself, I know what I'll do. I'll go and hire the outgoing head of the government department that does all of this. I mean, the stated mission of the Ellison Medical Foundation was to complement what the government was already funding. It would be impossible to find a better way to not do that, but instead to only supplement what the government is doing and add like 1 or 2% to the pay line, than to hire the person who used to run the fucking thing. Plus, of course, this is a guy, his name was Dick Sprott, who used to actually describe himself as the world's second most pessimistic gerontologist. So, I mean, I've just got no words. And sure enough, the Ellison Medical Foundation did very, very, very nearly nothing to advance the field, with $500 million.
Eh,
And then he closed it down pretty much overnight with no warning. The reason why he closed it down was, again, not stated, but everybody says that it's because he heard that his good friends, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, were about to launch something bigger. And so he, Larry Ellison, was no longer going to get any limelight for what he was doing. So he thought, well, fuck this, I'm not going to do it anymore. And of course, that's what they did, Larry and Sergey. They created this thing called Calico, which was exactly no better. First of all, Larry and Sergey had this fucked up idea that you shouldn't fund non-profits because non-profits are not inefficient when it comes to technological progress. I mean, that's bad. But it's only slightly bad because the fact is, when they created Calico, they decided that they didn't need to make any money out of it until like the 21st, 22nd century. So it was functionally a non-profit in orbit and so far. But then, just the fact that they'd both had plenty of conversations with me 10 years earlier, they said, I know what we'll do. We'll just put our fingers in the air and just do what our gut feeling tells us is the right thing to fund. And so the first thing they did, they got right. They said, okay, we need someone at the back end of all of this. When you've got a process going from concept to research to proven concepts to product, right? And they thought, well, okay, how do we do the last part, going from a proven concept to a product? And they thought to themselves, what we're going to do is we're going to hire the world's best biotech CEO. And they did. And that was fine. But then they left him to his own devices. They just completely didn't care about the fact that he didn't know how to do the early parts, and that he didn't even know that he didn't know how to do the early parts. So what the guy does, despite my desperate attempts to advise him otherwise, is he goes and hires, as a chief science officer, a guy named David Botstein. Fantastic scientist, actually was a good friend of my first wife, way back, because they were the same age. My wife died last year at the age of 79. Botstein's about the same age. Botstein's a fantastic basic scientist, with the emphasis on the word basic. He is on record as saying that he doesn't have a translational bone in his body. Now, there's no harm in having someone like that on your team, but what Levinson did not do was to hire someone to bridge the gap between the basic science and the product. He didn't hire a chief technology officer. He could have hired me in a trice. I would have done it for free. Not that the money was an issue, of course. And the result is Calico has produced exactly no more in the 10 years it's existed than the Ocean Medical Foundation did. Again, a complete waste of billions of dollars.
And
So then Bezos. Bezos first got interested in this when he saw me speak at TED in 2006. And, he was very interested at once. And year after year, when I would come back to TED and he was always there, he would come up to me on his own initiative and would ask for updates and everything. It was great. He had me along to some retreat that he ran in Santa Fe in probably 2012 or something like that. So it took him a hell of a long time to finally pull his finger out and write some proper checks. But once he did, he wrote them in a big way. I mean, $3 billion is a lot of money, right? But again, first of all, he's another of these people who think that charities don't work in technology. But secondly, he just got enamored by one particular component of doing something about aging, namely epigenetic reprogramming. And I'm not saying epigenetic reprogramming is irrelevant. Certainly it's not. It's great. Plus also, one thing that Bezos has done a lot better than Larry and Sergey or Ellison is he hired a lot of the best scientists in the field, like 20 of them as PIs.
Okay.
So there's no groupthink going on. Stuff will come out of Altos. I'm pretty sure that is, considerably better than anything that came out of Calico. But it won't be anywhere near as good as it could be. So far, the only person in that kind of bracket who has more or less got it right is Sam Altman. Sam Altman wrote a $180 million check to a very smart guy who not only knows how to run a business, but also, talk to me, named Jeff Bezos. And that money is being spent moderately well. So, things are improving. But if the billionaires of this world, after having decided that, yes, aging is actually the world's most important problem and they should use their resources to address it, would actually then talk to people who actually fucking know something rather than just trusting their gut feeling or trusting, some guy they went to high school with. That's actually happened as well.
Wow. That's so interesting that, well, obviously who you hire is important, but, I didn't realize billions, millions of dollars can kind of go wasted if you don't really critically think about who you're hiring. And I actually
it's a
didn't.
matter of asking people who actually know shit.
Yeah.
Taking the advice of people who actually know something.
For sure. Yeah. Wait, that's interesting. I actually, I don't know why I didn't realize Sam Altman was even interested in the aging space, but like you said, I just searched it up. He invested $180 million or something like that.
The company's called Retro Biosciences.
Retro Biosciences. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for explaining that. Okay. Yeah. Maybe kind of the last couple of questions I have here for you. The first being, if you could send a message to the future, people living 500 years from now in a world where, let's say, aging is solved in the sense that we've been able to significantly repair this damage to where we can actually have people live longer lives, increase the lifespan. What would you say to these people? Would you hope that they are thinking about you?
I'd say sorry. Michael Rose actually said this. Michael Rose, do you know who he is?
I don't
He's
know.
a professor at UC Irvine. He shot to fame in the 1980s when he was very young. He was still a grad student because he was the first person to demonstrate that lifespan could be rather rapidly increased by selection. He did selection for late fecundity in fruit flies, and he rather rapidly doubled the lifespan. Made him quite famous. But he was one of the very, very few people back then who was willing to put his head above the parapet and say that aging is actually quite a bad thing and we should try to do something about it. Back then, people were, unspeakably politically correct. And you could not talk about doing anything about aging in a grant application and have the faintest prayer of getting it funded. This was a transitional. So let me explain the ancient history of this. So originally, the whole field was founded on a translational biomedical basis. People actually wanted to do something about aging, and through until about the 1960s, that was a standard way to be. And there was and the real titans of the field, people like Bernie Strehler and Denham Harmon and Roy Walford, they were totally out there saying we're doing our best. But then it became apparent that there might be a possibility of creating this thing called the National Institute on Aging, right? Which, of course, did come into existence in the early 1970s. And everyone got terribly scared of talking about things that might frighten the politicians, because the politicians were in this knee-jerk thing of, oh dear, how will we pay all the pensions if people live longer and so on. And so everybody stopped talking about this. Around 1980, a perfectly unsuspecting medic named Jim Freese wrote a paper called The Compression of Morbidity, which was misrepresented, shall we say, but anyway, which became the mantra of the field. It became absolutely unacceptable to talk about intervention. And Michael was one of the very few. So Harmon, who created the free radical theory of aging back in the 50s, he actually left the GSA, the Gerontological Society of America, and created a whole new society called the American Aging Association, which for decades was an absolute backwater, though now it's a very respected organization. Just in protest at the denial of the merits of doing anything about aging. Strehler died. Strehler was going to be the first of the NIA, and he was abruptly sidelined in favor of some geriatrician. A perfectly good geriatrician, a very well-meaning guy named Bob Butler, who was a lovely man, but not the right man for the job. Anyway, enough of ancient history. The point is, this all changed only as a result of a few people. First, there was Michael Rowe. Then there was Cynthia Kenyon. She did an experiment that was published in 1993, the first experiment doubling, well, actually, it wasn't the first, it was the second time that people were able to manipulate one gene in C. elegans and double their lifespan. And it worked, of course, in the usual way by messing around with insulin IGF signaling, same as calorie restriction does. The first person who did it was 5 years earlier. It was a guy named Tom Johnson in Colorado. Tom Johnson is perhaps, just less charismatic, but the main thing is he was first, and this was so antithetical to the dogma of the field that you could have one gene that would extend lifespan, because people didn't think it through and realize that they were just activating calorie restriction, basically. But Cynthia did it, and she was also very courageous. She didn't even have tenure at the time, and she went out and basically, made a real nuisance of herself. And then the third person in this sequence was, of course, me. It was tough being against aging back then. I can't remember why I launched into that rant. I'm sure there was a reason.
No, yeah, to me, now as a student, it's such a prominent field. It's gained a lot of mainstream popularity on social media. There's docu-series about it. It's such a huge thing. So
and that's largely because of Michael and Cynthia and especially me. Because we basically went out and we were completely fearless about embarrassing people into being slightly more rational about these things. And also, of course, talking about how it is just an engineering problem, and therefore it's completely clear that we will eventually do it, and getting away with it. I had the most extraordinarily tough time. You can go back and look at the literature from 20 years ago when I was being beaten up by the establishment in this field. But the fact is, everything I was saying was true and irrefutable, and eventually that was accepted. So I imagine you have heard of a paper called The Hallmarks of Aging.
Yeah, your 7 kind of markers.
Yeah, my paper from...
Is that different?
Oh, yes, very different. Well, when I say very different, what I mean is no, it's not different. What happened was in 2013, so 11 years after my paper came out, a group of very prominent and mainstream and terribly authoritative people came out and basically rewrote what I said and pretended it was original. And the thing is, by then I'd done the hard work of, wearing down the irrational opposition, which means that by the time they did it, its time had come. And it got published in Cell, and it has become by a huge distance the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this century. There are some problems with it, I have to say, but, it does rather help that I no longer have to go out and justify this whole way of thinking about aging in
Yeah.
anymore. But the point is, by then, it was okay to be talking about interventions. In fact, now
Sure.
you can't not talk about it. It's like you've got to say how your thing is going to have translational potential. Yeah, so it's night and day.
Yeah.
Since you're in Harvard, you've got the right people to talk to about this. You should sit down face to face over a beer with David Sinclair or George Church, or especially Vadim Gladyshev. Do you know him? Gladyshev is at Harvard. He is, out of all the really prominent people in the biology of aging, Gladyshev is the one whose views are most similar to mine. I've often described him as me without the rough edges. He doesn't swear.
Yeah.
He doesn't swear very much. But yeah, I mean, you would learn more in one afternoon with Gladyshev than you would in a year in classes.
Absolutely. Great. I think maybe the last question I wanted to leave you off with, and it might be a little bit maybe too much, but
There's no such thing. Okay.
might be a rough question to end with, but you've obviously been associated with the transhumanist movement, which makes sense. Humans should radically enhance themselves with technology. With the advent of AI and obviously AGI, or at least soon to come, do you have a timeline, and how do you kind of coincide that development with the field of longevity? Like, should humans, like, is it a worthwhile effort if humans are going to be miserable in like a post-AGI world, like, or maybe not? I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but how do you kind of reconcile these two things of like, we should be optimizing human health span and also the advent of technology that could
So it's
utterly destroy that?
yeah. So it's pretty hard to give a short answer to that question. So I'm going to give it.
That's why I was maybe
Right.
skeptical of
So
ending.
first of all, in terms of transhumanism, so transhumanism per se, there's a contrast between transhumanism, the movement, and transhumanism, the word. I definitely consider myself a transhumanist in the sense that I'm in favor of our efforts to enhance the human condition and enhance human, quality of life and so on in all ways without limit. And as far as I'm concerned, opposition to transhumanism consists in feeling that there is some limit beyond which we should not go because it's evil or unnatural or some stupid thing like that. So in that sense, I am a transhumanist. However, I think that the word is an enormous foot-shooting exercise. I think that, it makes it sound as though we think that being human in the first place is somehow unsatisfactory and we need to fix that, which I think is nonsense, and I also think it's extraordinarily bad PR. Nevertheless, I haven't got very far in, selling that to the transhumanists. Now, if we go to AI specifically, of course, since before I came along, there have been people like Eliezer Yudkowsky highlighting that AI is quite dangerous, and we could fuck ourselves up that rather badly. Now, the good news is that we've got really smart people who understand exactly that and who are trying to get the best of both worlds. Of course, some people are more pessimistic than others. Jan Tallinn spends most of his life dancing, and I ask him why, and he says it's because I don't think any of us is going to be around for more than another 5 years or so.
Scary.
Whereas other people take the opposite view, right? I don't really in any way consider myself remotely an expert or able to form an educated opinion on this. But luckily, I know a lot of people who are, and I trust them. In terms of the relationship between AI and my work, which is the last part of your question, well, of course, there's plenty of ways in which AI today, as opposed to AGI, is, contributing to biomedical research to a huge degree. Obviously, AlphaFold is a great example. AlphaProteo, which of course does the opposite. You take a three-dimensional shape and you figure out an amino acid sequence that will adopt that shape. That's even bigger. In fact, so big that people haven't really figured out how to use it yet. I'm sure that AI will play a huge role. It is, however, rather important to ensure that people don't just sit back and say, oh, AI will fix everything for us. Some people are in danger of doing that. In fact, Sam Altman almost did that. So Sam, as I said, he wrote this $180 million check to Joe Betts to create Retro. Great.
Right.
But then, as I say, I keep in touch with Joe quite a bit. Joe started telling me that Sam had just kind of lost interest. And I started hearing things like Sam saying publicly that he felt that, yes, aging was very important, but, let's just create AI, and the AI will tell us what experiments to do, and it'll all be fine. Kind of overlooking the minor detail that AI does not generate data out of thin air. What it does is it generates insights from data. AlphaFold absolutely could not have been created without PDB, the protein database, the crystallographic. Yeah. And PDB could not have been created without many, many months of mind-numbing, tedious crystallography over decades.
Crystallography, yeah.
Right. So, we've got to actually do the fucking experiments now to give AI the best chance. So I've been saying this publicly, and I have a feeling it may have got back to Sam because he's been saying slightly more sensible things lately than he might actually write Retro and other check soon. But, that's the way people like me have to operate, right?
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. de Grey. It's really been a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate the amount of candor. Honesty.
Candor.
Candor. I should have known that. Harvard student. What's my degree doing for
Hey,
you?
I went to Cambridge in the UK, which actually is perhaps a little bit better for that kind of thing.
Perhaps so. Yeah, really appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Likewise. Same to you. Bye for now.